you. I'm delighted and honored to be back. Can you all hear? Okay, if I fade out at some point, you just give me a yell. Sometimes these phallic objects sort of, go out on me. Well, Pat Robertson, we are here. I really cannot tell you what a joy, what a sort of personal, vindictive glee suffused me when I heard that you wanted me to come to Iowa at this moment in herstory. For those of you who have been, abroad or down a well or something like that, or on the moon, or in intensive care perhaps, or something, Pat Robertson, who is a man who, with such a high, deep, and abiding regard for the truth that he uses it sparingly, decided that Iowa was where the battle with the Rad Femmes would be joined. And did us a tremendous favor by announcing to us what the radical feminist agenda really was, which it's always so helpful, for the weak vessels that women are, to have white, straight, reactionary, conservative men tell us what it is we really think and feel. This is not particularly new, you might notice. It has been going on for something like 12,000 years, but once in a while they throw one up who's really special. And that's Pat. So, for those of you who, as I say, might not have been in touch with what the radical feminist agenda was, or for those of us who might have thought that we were about something else entirely, like, say, for example, freeing more than half the human species and by implication, humanizing the other half, have now learned what it is that we're really about, and that we have made Iowa a target. Have you noticed that these boys cannot speak in terms other than militaristic metaphor? So, for those of you who might not know, the feminist agenda, Pat has now informed us, is not about equal rights for women. No, silly, if that's what you thought. It is about a socialist, anti-family political movement that encourages women to leave their husbands, kill their children, practice witchcraft, destroy capitalism, and become lesbians. Now, I could take each one of the things on this list and either confirm or deny, depending on my mood, as a matter of fact, except for killing children, which is usually actually something that men in war do far better than women under any circumstances, and that the rich in this country do to the poor, since the primary cause of children's death in this country is poverty. But I'm not going to bother taking each of his accusations point by point. I do, as a somewhat sobering thought, however, want to remind you, while we're sort of chortling in glee at how absolutely asinine sometimes these people can be, that this year, 92, marks the 300th anniversary of the Salem-Danvers witch trials in this country, during which 14 women were tortured and murdered. They called it execution. And it was, as usual, for economic reasons, because, in fact, if you accused whoever you accused, their lands fell to the accuser. Now, no one particularly noticed that this might make for some pretty strange accusers, or rather they did. In any event, enough about good old Pat. Tempting as it would be to spend all our time on him, I really don't want to spend time reacting when we could be acting instead. You all see on your seats, and I'm sure you knew before that, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more later on when we get to the question and answer period, all of the wonderful announcements and organizing that's going on over Amendment 1. Now, Ellie Smeal, who is an old friend, rang me up yesterday and said, "Oh, you're going to Iowa? Lucky you. I'm going there in a couple of weeks." And I said, "Oh, yes." And so she said, "You do know about Amanda Woman?" "Yes, Ellie," I said, "I know about it." We always do this to each other. We assume that, you're busy doing this part, you might not know about that part. And in fact, sometimes you don't, and it's very helpful and so forth. She said, "Ha, but I bet you didn't know about another amendment that's coming up for the referendum, which is about dueling in the state of Iowa." Now, she had me there. I did not know that the voters in November were not only going to pick president and local and state representatives, and in fact vote by the goddess, I hope, to ensure that whatever happens on a national level, at least Iowa will be space in which female human beings are recognized as equal to male human beings. But that also, I do think it's probably time to take dueling off the books. Now, I did have to think about this for a minute. I thought, well, perhaps it's that kind of thing that if the boys are busy doing that, maybe rape statistics, battery statistics, violence against women, sexual molestation, sexual harassment, all that kind of stuff might go down. But no, then I remembered that, in fact, violence is a continuum, and the more one part of the continuum is practiced, even if it's simply on the books and not practiced anymore in the old touche fashion, it's practiced in other ways. So anytime it can be got rid of in any way, shape, or form, the better. Tonight I'm going to talk, well, in a rather eclectic fashion, definitely not linear, sort of leaping from one thing to another. This is, as you know, so the pundits have proclaimed it, the year of the woman. Now, I don't know how many of you have been going around muttering to yourself as I have, what the hell makes them think we're going to settle for 1 year? They ain't seen nothing yet. But this is also not new. At one point, you remember, they gave us International Women's Year. This was in 1975. If you stop for a minute and you think, well, has there ever been International Men's Year? You realize the absurdity of the whole exercise. In any event, we managed to stretch that one out to a whole decade. So there was the Decade of Women, at the end of which they thought we would be quiet and shut up and go home. What is your problem? You've had 10 years where we have written white papers and talked about you, but we haven't done anything about it, but in fact we have paid lip service. What are you, greedy? And we didn't shut up and go home at that point. So now it is the year of the woman, which is a completely specious media idea. I do think that it's a remarkable year, and I do think it's one of those extraordinary situations where after, it's like an overnight success that's taken 20 years to build. 25 years of this wave of the women's movement in this country, and it's like you fill the cup gets filled, the cup of insult, more and more and more, and then it just finally takes sort of a couple of last drops, and then it brims. And certainly last year there were a number of such drops, probably primary among them, wonderful, courageous Professor Anita Hill. As well, Desiree Washington speaking out against Mike Tyson, and Patricia Bowman against William Kennedy Smith. And issues that had been thought to be wild and crazy, broom-riding, radical feminist, marginal issues, suddenly, what do you know, surfaced as matters of real anguish in the everyday lives of real women all across this country. And a whole lot of the women who are in fact running for office on local and state and federal levels are doing so because of that amazing vision that was seared into all our eyes of all those straight, white, boring, sexist men sitting up there, and this one small African-American female person in a turquoise dress telling the truth and what they did or tried to do to her. So, in terms of its being the year of the woman, I want to talk about what is called leadership, because I think now we better begin to examine that. We're into another phase where we no longer have to sort of say, hello, we're here. For 25 years we've been, as they put it, shrill and strident, for simply saying, hello, we're here, we're dying. And now we are at a critical juncture where, in fact, we will have more women in positions of relative political power. I would like to ground our sense of the fear of our being terminally grateful, because the truth is that even if every single woman running for office were to win, we still would not have parity, representation in this country. On the other hand, you can bet your bottom dollar that if less than every single woman running wins, there will be media experts who will pronounce the Year of the Woman clearly a failure. So either way, it's a start. It's a new level, as we would say in the 60s, of struggle. And it carries with it new joys and new responsibilities and new dangers. And one of them are ways of regarding leadership, in heavy quotes, and redefining it, I think, in our terms instead of accepting it in patriarchy's terms. And redefinition itself always leads to language. And the theme of this Women's Week is naming and empowering and speaking the unspeakable, which has always been the heartbeat of feminist energy. So to put it in context, in this Year of the Woman, I would remind you that 2/3 of all illiterate people on the face of the earth are female. And while the male illiteracy rate is declining, the female illiteracy rate is growing. 80% of all refugee populations are women and children. The basics that we all know and struggle with every day, the two bottom line bedrock issues of reproductive freedom and freedom of sexual choice, are not only U.S. issues, but they're international issues. But there's no issue that is not a feminist issue. One of the things that kind of makes my teeth go into automatic grind is when people refer to women's issues or feminist issues, because we're talking about the majority of the human species. So racism is a feminist issue, and class discrimination is a feminist issue, and discrimination against differently abled people is a feminist issue, and homophobia, sure as hell, is a feminist issue, and discrimination against the young or the very old is a feminist issue, particularly in the United States, where we face the graying of America and where the largest growing population in this country are people over 60, and the majority of them are female people. The environment is a feminist issue, and not only because we would like to preserve the earth, not only because of some abstract affection for it, but in a very grounded way, a very, in the best sense of the term, selfish way. I always worry about the word selfless. If you think about it, it's a pretty spooky word. So I don't mean selflessness. I mean in a way that is organically connected. For example, in the Pacific Island women's movement, the International Women's Movement is always very instructive about making these connections. In the Pacific Island women's movement, the environment is not an abstract thing at all. I mean, for at least 30 years, women in Vanuatu and Fiji and all across the Pacific have been organizing to stop the atomic bomb tests there, which no longer are done by the United States, but which are still, in fact, done, nuclear testing by France. And the reason that they were in the forefront of that struggle was that they noticed they began to give birth to what they called jellyfish babies. That is, births that were stillborn or had no spine or had no limbs. And when they first went to the men about this and said, we think this is connected to those strange tests over there, their men said, no, it's your fault. You must be bad women, you didn't propitiate the gods, you're a bad mother, it has nothing to do. It took them at least 20 years of just women's organizing to even get the men on board. And finally, of course, when the men came on board, then you have to understand it was a serious issue. Then it became a real movement. Men were now involved. It was grown up. People got salaried. And the Pacific Free New Zealand and Fiji and Aotearoa and Vanuatu and generally the nuclear-free Pacific movement was born. But nobody remembers the indigenous women of the Pacific who, for those first 30 years, started it all. And that's only one of what could be hundreds of examples of environment. My sister poet and feminist friend Christos is here, and you know that she's reading tomorrow night and also speaking, and can tell you far better than I can the disaster wreaked on the Native American nations, particularly in this year of the counter-quincentennial of Columbus's arrival and the conquest and the genocide. not only of the people, but of the land. And all of that are feminist issues. And obviously the rising tide of violence against women, which some call backlash and some call normality, whether it's rape or battery or sexual molestation, acquaintance rape, torture, sexual harassment, that whole spectrum, connected up with international slave traffic in women and children, connected up with pornography, which is basically a propaganda of hate, just like racist literature, just like Ku Klux Klan literature. All of those and more are feminist issues. It's important, I think, to always keep the context in mind and the connections in mind, particularly in a year like this one, when the press is telling all of us, women, activists, and men of conscience, aren't you lucky? Isn't this wonderful? Year of the woman, all these women running. Hey, no more problems. And when the elections are done, I mean, we certainly hope that there will be a change of administration in Washington. Not that I think that Clinton is a feminist prince, I assure you, but as I said in one editorial, at this point, listen, I am desperate. I would vote for a gerbil. And I may be voting for a gerbil, but it is not Bush, and that's something. And even more exciting are the extraordinary women who are running all over this country. Ada Deer bodes to be the first Native American congresswoman. Carol Moseley Brown bodes to be the first African American senator. And one could go on. And they're fierce, and they're remarkable, and they're fun. There's a fantastic woman in California who's running, who's a welfare mom. We just recently engaged in this hilarious quixotic effort at Ms. It's one of those things where you get this wonderful idea and you think, oh yeah, let's do that. And then once you're doing it, you think, oh my God, why did we do this? This is an enormous, and we don't have the people, the time, the money, but you're locked in. It's too late. You can't back out. So we did the Ms. Guide to Women Candidates. We hadn't realized that there were like 2,500 more, in fact. We had to finally cut it off. We didn't go below the mayoral level, which made me very sad. But even just to do state senates and state assemblies, gubernatorial and federal candidates was over 2,500 names. And to survey those and get their positions on at least 5 basic revealing issues was as much as we could handle, given the fact that there are 14 of us very tired women. And that was amazingly exciting, particularly to see what so many of them stood for. In other words, a critical mass of them are not just male clones running, but they're real women. And they're furious and energetic and innovative. I think, as I said earlier, that we're now moving to another level where things get a little more complex. In other words, I think all of us have to, once those women are elected, move into gear on 2 fronts. They are going to really need our support. They are going to face staggering pressure and soul-eroding deals because they haven't come up, most of them, through the political system. And how it works and how the backroom deals get made and how the dirty politics is played is going to really hit them like bullets between the eyes, and some of them are going to go down unless we are really there with cards and letters and calls in support for those women. And at the same time, unless we are reminding them of their accountability to us. It's sort of a feminist version of stick with me, baby, you know, we're the ladies you came in with. It would be awfully easy to forget that. And to remind them that we put them in there to change the system, not to be changed by it. And that will not be easy for them to remember. So keep an eye on those wonderful women that you vote for, whether it is on a local, state, or federal level. And this is not the moment to relax and think, well, maybe now life can go back to normal. Probably most of you know that anyway. I mean, you're feminists and you're men of conscience. Life will never go back to normal, okay? Life will be supernormal, subnormal, and eventually just normal. But in our terms, not fortunately in the terms of the society, and I hope never again in Pat Robertson's terms. Okay, if these women are going to be our new, in a sense, public leaders, This makes me happy. This makes me nervous. Because so far we have not really done enough to throw up alternative modes of, or definitions of leadership. And whenever feminism hasn't redefined something, I get nervous. Because in fact, one of the things that we're about is totally redefining everything. Absolutely. Whatever it is, to totally redefine it. So that it is inclusive and no longer exclusive. So that it is PC in the best sense, which really stands for plain courtesy. I've never been able to take on board why some folks feel so incredibly threatened by the rich enrichment that multiculturalism brings to anything, whether it's a magazine like Ms., whether it's a campus, whether it's a curriculum. My God, I mean, as opposed to the monoculturalism that we've all been inflicted with and that people of my generation were grown up being educated with and that we had to spend a whole lot of time unwarping our minds from. What an incredible feast to be faced with then, of the best of art and literature and song and dance, of culture, of knowledge, of science, of politics, from peoples all over the world. In any event, okay, so in the face of redefining political correctness as plain courtesy, we've also got to take on leadership. And I made some notes about what leadership might mean in feminist terms. And obviously this is hardly definitive. This is yet another little foray, a beginning, so that we can take that up and you can turn it inside out or take it further or change it utterly or throw it over. Leadership itself is a word sort of calculated to give feminists and other radicals indigestion. It's not out of fear about inadequacy, but it's out of a practiced vigilance about the man's definitions. And in plain daily living, feminists generally have fallen into one or two attitudes in our reaction to the concept of leadership, okay? And these attitudes could sort of be summarized superficially in the following two statements. Each are sort of polar positions. One would be leading at anything is inherently elitist because it implies one leader, which in turn implies at least one or even many followers. This causes capitalist emotions such as pain. We are all the same, and the lowest common denominator, therefore, has to be the vanguard. The only pure sign of leadership is failure, and martyrdom is even better, highly preferable. Now, this sort of worldview, you understand, would have paralyzed Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Althea Gibson, Empress Wu, quite a few others, but never mind. Now, at the other pole, we have the I will make it in a man's world approach, which is sort of like ambition and drive and leadership are just as much female characteristics as they are male. Therefore, women shouldn't worry about definitions at all, but instead should bend all of our energies toward excelling and being the one leader. Leadership over men, each other, children, small animals, ferns. Killer competition is healthy and it's good for the complexion. Women have every right to gain fame, power, and wealth by any means necessary from the boardroom to the bedroom, and the only sure sign of leadership is power and success. Now this, at its extreme sort of cosmopolitan girl argument, would effectively have knocked out people like Shirley Chisholm and Emily Dickinson and Helen Keller, but never mind that either. There's a kernel of truth in each of these polar reactions, despite the fact that neither the temporary garland of leadership nor the self-consoling purity of ultra-egalitarianism is any indicator of excellence or, for that matter, of real leadership. So I always like to look for the third way whenever faced with that boring bifurcation, either or patriarchal thinking that it has to be this or it has to be that. I'm much more interested in both and. And so I was playing around with conceiving leadership as in three different ways, a sort of tripartite kind of leadership. Three different kinds of leaders. There would, for example, be the creator or the initiator, who would be that person who dares to break new ground, to think of or name something that no one has thought or articulated before, or to do something that others have only thought or spoken about before. Creators are those who would raise new issues, forge or explore new territories, pioneer new forms. There would be the organizer, who would expand a raw idea or issue, or translate it into more populist and accessible terms, do outreach, explain, educate, give shape to, or discover an organic order in the issue. And there would be the consolidator, who usually by a coincidence of history and timing, along with talent and commitment, carries the idea or the message to where it has even more effective impact than before, who brings it, as it were, into power, who integrates it through the general consciousness, and who consolidates the previously expressed creativity and the previously laid groundwork. Now, reapproaching leadership with these types in mind feels to me much more comfortable than settling for the traditional rejection of or worship of the concept. It means, for instance, that there are different ways of leading. It broadens the field so that more people qualify. Most of us do fall temperamentally into one or another of these categories. In fact, it even means, this is nicest of all, I think, that the same person might lead as a different type at different times in her own life. At the very least, it's a new parlor game, okay? For instance, wasn't Maxine Hong Kingston a good example of the initiator, the first to break silence about Asian American women? Wasn't Mary McLeod Bethune a perfect organizer, coordinating previous political and social work by black women in the southern United States and founding new umbrella organizations? Isn't, for example, Lynn Yackel or Carol Moseley Braun or Ada Deer or any of the women who are running for public office, aren't they, in effect, consolidators, coasting on but also furthering 20 years of intense contemporary feminist activism in this country? But let's forget for a moment about the so-called well-knowns. It's even more revealing, I think, to look at ourselves and our neighbors, our feminist sisters, our colleagues in this light. The women say, who first raised lonely and isolated voices about being incest survivors, initiators. Oh yeah. The women who said that being afraid or furious about rape was no longer sufficient, and who formed rape crisis centers and started hotlines, organizers. The women who actually forged not censorship but legal civil rights wording against pornography for the Minneapolis Ordinance, consolidators. More often than not, you'll find yourself and whatever issue you're working on, in private or public, in one category or another, and at times with the extra bonus of an overlap of categories. But there are a few warnings. We none of us have to do it all. This is something that women tell each other and ourselves all the time and still don't hear. We none of us have to do it all. Recognizing one's own limitations while sharpening one's appetite for life may be the first move toward wisdom. That's the whole point about different types of leadership. And there are different rewards. We can each of us get envious sometimes at any of the three. At the solitary courage and the private joy that we sense somehow the initiator feels, which can be misperceived, I might add, as individualistic snobbery. We can get envious at the energy or the community support or the feelings of accomplishment that the organizer enjoys. Although if we're feeling cranky, we can misperceive that as personal ambition. And we can be envious of the impact or even the fame, yes, of the consolidator, who can be misperceived as an opportunistic co-optator. But remember, there's always a hidden balance. Consolidators are not necessarily creative, and they have to learn to face and accept that. Organizers often never live to see the results of their labors, and they have to learn to persevere despite that. And initiators sometimes go uncelebrated and unremembered, and they must learn to let free their creation independent of their own egos. I think that finding out perhaps where one organically fits and can best contribute, keeping in mind that you might switch roles at different times over different issues and at different times in your lives, and also where you can fully be satisfied with the relevant type of reward, I think that's one mark of leadership. Forcing oneself into some arbitrary category because of envy or competition or others' expectations, surely that's not a mark. And even when the latter seems successful, it can make the person wretched. I remember reading an article by Leonard Bernstein shortly before the end of his life, when with his incredible success and the reverence in which the art world held him and the music world, and my God, he was jet-setting all over the world, in which he said, I failed because I got seduced by the glitter of being a public figure, of conducting, and I didn't compose. I haven't composed enough. And ultimately, that's what would have lived. So for myself, I feel I failed. So, I mean, ultimately, it is that self you have to live with. A creator-initiator dare not be seduced by glitter. An organizer dare not be discouraged by the slowness of history. And a consolidator must not be ignorant of all those who have forged and formed the way and must remain accountable to their risk and to their vision. And one more little warning about leadership. It's also strangely, I think, a reassurance. It has a long fuse, leadership, real leadership. It's a thing of duration. And it's also like a coral reef, a thing of accumulation. Clearly, now that I think of it, it is also somewhat of a mixed metaphor, which I have just indulged in. We can recognize it, however, in the brilliant flares of certain heartbreakingly short lives, like Anne Frank or Mozart. But we see it, I think, more steadily in the steady burning of long, almost epic lives. Simone de Beauvoir, Rosa Parks, Marie Curie, Teresa of Avila, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and Johann Sebastian Bach, Black Elk, Gandhi. I could go on and on. In other words, simple enduring is one possible route to excellence, which is all the more reason to fight for longer and healthier lives, both for ourselves, for children, and for the planet itself. Well, I throw that out so that you can begin to think of ways in which you can redefine and transform leadership, because the period of our being totally on the outside has begun to commence to start to change. Please don't mishear me. We are not on the inside. And in fact, we don't want to be on the inside as the inside is now structured. We want to totally transform it. So this is a particularly dangerous, exciting, new level that we move into now. And it's one where we never even had a chance to sell out before, okay? We never even had a chance to be co-opted. And now there are new dangers, and I want to alert us to those so that we can begin to construct tactics and strategies as creative for dealing with those as we are used to in the streets, now that we have to take the streets into the legislatures as well. One basic strategy always, which isn't even a strategy, it's just us, is naming. Now, for those of us who are crazy feminist writers, words are a special curse, blessing, burden, responsibility, and magic. It is quite true, as the theme of this week posits, that for women, and I would venture to say for all oppressed peoples, but certainly for women, the oldest, longest oppressed people on earth, and not a minority, the simple act of naming is the first act of revolution. It's the equivalent to the cannon shot of the revolution. Fortunately, it's not as lethal, although it may be as deadly. It certainly is as powerful. The last essay in the new book is called The Word of a Woman. And it seemed fitting to share some parts of it with you tonight, since in a very large way, it's about what this week is about. It's a strange essay. I mean, many of the essays in this book are not so strange. I mean, they sort of start in 1968 with the participatory journalism coverage of the first Miss America pageant, which is definitely participatory and not objective journalism, since I was one of the organizers. But objective journalism is a myth of the New York Times anyway, so phooey. And it then, sort of goes on up through the years as the issues change, the consciousness shifts, one woman's voice mirroring the changes in the women's movement, coming to terms with changes in my own life, whether political, sexual, psychological, social, you name it, all of them seeming to run in some one way or another parallel to, sometimes a tiny bit ahead, much of the time a tiny bit behind the women's movement, but writing nonetheless. And then straight up through 1992. And this is the last essay in the book, and this is the title essay, the essay for which the book is named. So I will read you some sections from it. The Word of a Woman. In 1991, the world learned of a recently discovered ancient language devised at least 1,000 years earlier in a mountainous region of the Hunan province in central China. It was a totally female language. An Associated Press story by Kathy Wilhelm quoted a China Daily newspaper report that researchers had uncovered hundreds of stories, poems, songs, and letters written over the past millennium in a unique script invented by rural women for their own secret use. Nushi, which means women's writing. Nushi used characters derived from Standard Chinese to represent the syllables of the local dialect. Standard Chinese has no such phonetic base. It uses characters pictographically to represent meaning only. Chinese linguists believe that the women developed the script because they were forbidden to learn standard writing. Numerous as the remaining texts are, comparatively few survive because women valued them so highly that they willed the Nushi to be placed in their coffins so that the cherished writings might be reread even after death. Such intimacy with and loyalty to the created word may seem bizarre to contemporary sensibilities, relentlessly assaulted as we are by commercial hype, political jargon, trendy buzzwords, and a general cheapening of expression. But it may seem less curious once one realizes that for hundreds of years, women used the script to record their hidden emotions and to communicate with one another surreptitiously. As one Nushi author wrote, "Men leave home to brave life in the outside world, but we women are no less courageous. We can create a language they cannot understand." These were the words of a woman who might as well have written, "We shall not suffer in silence," because this female language was an underground code, an act of rebellion in conception, an utterance of rebellion in content. The writings gleam with rage at women's lot, at arranged marriages, brutal and vulgar husbands, the right of men to take numerous wives and divorce women whenever they chose, at enforced chastity for women and required allegiance to one man, even if widowed while young, of beatings survived and insults to human dignity endured, of being treated, as the women wrote, like slaves. But the tone was not always one of suppressed wrath. Some Nushi mourned the loss of a beloved woman friend to marriage. Thread-bound books of poems and songs would be given to a bride 3 days after her wedding, tokens of grief that she could no longer spend time with her women friends, commemorative artifacts of the relative freedom of her single life, and talismanic sources of strength to aid her survival as a wife. Apparently, the practice of Nushi declined once females were permitted access to education. When scholars began researching the script in the 1980s, they could locate only a dozen elderly women still able to read it. Only 3 could still write it. Yet the language had been preserved, alive, intact, and secret for 1,000 years. It is in honor of these eloquent ancestors, the Nushi authors, that this following essay is written and dedicated, because we can create a language they cannot understand. And the essay takes the form of a letter to a reader in 2992. Dearest friend of my imagination's optimism, dust whispers as you read this, whether from the page, the computer screen, or via some other communicative form beyond current comprehension. Intimate dust, brain cell past to brain cell future. These are messages from a human being hubristic enough to have faith in the power of words, even those of her own awkward making, mad enough to believe that mind must cease treating matter, and matter stop treating mind as other. So I dare address you from what they call my time, which is not yet my time, 8 years short of a new century and more dramatically, of a new millennium. It requires an absurd leap of faith to believe that you are at all. If sentient life on this planet survives even the next 100 years, or if sentient life from elsewhere in the universe someday sifts curiously or indifferently through the ruins we leave of the ruins we are, what might be said of us? It might be said of us, they lived in a savage time. They fouled their own home. They ate flesh, warred on one another, kept slaves. They actually believed that the shape and the color of their shells was of importance. Their politics were even cruder than their technology. They feared their own intelligence and so ignored it. They failed to comprehend the obvious intelligence of their relatives, whether dolphin or cactus, eagle or redwood, monkey, lizard, spider, clay. Their greatest generosity was in sharing pain. They did not even understand their own energy, much less the field. It will be a subject of some debate, I imagine, from which of two flaws we suffered most or perished totally, delusion or denial. So here is a shred of evidence, a testimony, a minority report, a voice from this epoch in which I sometimes live imprisoned. These are what they call the realities of my age. It is the age of nuclear patriarchy. Our androcentric worldview has become a life-threatening disease. But it is also, one way or the other, the age of terminal patriarchy. For I am the Eve of Adam. The four horsemen of the apocalypse canter across our days and nights. War now goes by the name intervention. Pestilence bears the mark of HIV/AIDS. Famine is euphemized as underdevelopment. Death wears all these masks while filtering as well through perforations in the ozone layer, silting from soil and river, ebbing and flowing in ocean tides, entering our lungs and lives through palpable city smog or invisible radiation. More humans currently inhabit the earth than all those who have lived and died from the beginning of the human species until the present. World economic crisis is an ethically bereft phrase, insufficient to describe how the homeless curl against the dust pillows of Calcutta, squat like revenants in the necropolis of Cairo, hunch in cardboard co-ops on the concrete sidewalks of New York. World environmental crisis is a morally destitute phrase, inadequate to eulogize the 1 million species, 20% of all species, at risk of extinction, several hundred per day by the year 2000. It will be said of us, how could they not know? If they knew, why did they not act? How would I answer you, you of the not yet descendants or someday perhaps visitors? How would I answer you so that you might weep for us in pity and not laugh at us in incredulous contempt? Would I whine that we did not really know the extent of the peril, that we were kept from knowing the truth? This is true, but it is also an insufficient response. Would I claim that there were many who did know and some who even tried to act? This is also true, but surely a special pleading. Or would I be more honest and attempt to explain how most of our species regarded life and endured our own existence as an illusion, entering with willingly suspended disbelief into a cleverly convincing one-dimensional representation of the real thing? And would I rationalize that this was not the result of innocence but of experience? And how could I justify such a poverty of vision? The unlearned lesson that reality is an illusion lies at the heart of most major, even patriarchal, spiritual beliefs of my species, but rarely has this lesson been so painfully inflicted, yet so ignored as at present. Now, Jane Wagner, who you could say is the Nushi writer of this period, has asked and answered wittily, oh, what is reality anyway? A collective hunch. Today, however, the hunch is less collective than it is determined by those few who have the power to enforce the credibility of their lies. Another contemporary Nushi author, Adrienne Rich, has written about the necessity of being disloyal to civilization. She's quite right, of course. But beyond that indispensable basic disloyalty lies the need for disloyalty to culture itself. And even beyond that, the leap of becoming disloyal to reality, as they've defined it for us. Meanwhile, the bowl of sky is still sometimes a clear, unglazed blue. Tulips push through spring soil to redden the snow. The rain feels cleansing, not acidic. How then can the intensifying danger become vivid enough, soon enough, for us